So has Games Workshop finally managed to make one of the Titanic Chaos Knights an incredibly strong choice in an army list? Let's talk about the power of the dual gatling gun Despoiler, and what it can do if you feed it a few little sacrifices. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Chaos Knights, and in this video I was interested enough to cycle back to talk a little bit about one of the combos from the Chaos Knight detachment from earlier in the week, and put one knight through its paces that looks incredibly scary on paper. Despite really quite a lot of balance passes and rules changes and updates since the Codex Chaos Knights came out back in 9th edition, it is kind of surprising at just how consistently Games Workshop seems to have kept it as War Dog spam being pretty much the best way to play the army. In 9th edition it was often Abaddon the Despoiler doing a dog walk for 12 armoured hounds or so, and then in 10th edition with the index rules it seems to have been War Dog spam absolutely all the way. In the last 3 or so balance updates, Games Workshop seems to have kept nudging the Titanic Knights to make them just that tiny bit better versus the War Dogs. They're still not to the point where that many people are playing them. It's not that they're unusable, but just seem to be a little bit worse than their War Dog cousins. So I thought it was interesting to see at least one build for a big Titanic Knight that looks legitimately like a thing that you'd be really tempted by in your army list. The knight that I was focusing on for this video is the Knight Despoiler at 415 points, and using that inside the Iconoclast Fiefdom detachment, where you can put these on the table alongside a bunch of cultists. The Despoiler is currently 415 points in game, a standard abhorrent stat line of 22 wounds at toughness 12 with a 5+ invulnerable, and it's basically the one to represent the flexible Loyalist Questoris kit, being able to be armed in any way similar to a Gallant or a Crusader or anything in between. But it does have the interesting difference to the Imperial Knights in that you can take 2 copies of the ranged guns when the Imperial Knight Crusader can't. So if you want for this guy, you can have him double up on great big gatling cannons, or double battle cannons or thermal cannons if you want to. It allows him to be a bit more focused than the Loyalist Crusader. Compared with some of the other knights though, I feel like his special rules do leave a bit to be desired. He improves nearby War Dog battle shock, and his bonus rule is just a single reroll, hit roll or wound roll. That's not nothing, but it's also not awesome either, and a bit less so if he's going for volume attacks, as seems to be the best way for him in my opinion. I feel like perhaps one of the things that held him back a little bit versus some of the Imperials is the lack of direct damage boost in Chaos Knights. The Imperials get better inbuilt rerolls across the army on top of their datasheet rules, and things like that +1 to wound stratagem if you need it, but that's not really something that the Chaos Knights get. They can be better against battle shock things from round 3 onwards, but being time locked in the game and also dependent on battle shock both is a bit situational. It often means that the thing that he wants to target won't have that debuff. In the Iconoclast attachment though, you can make yourself some popular overlords of a bunch of cultists, and perhaps one of the more interesting and thematic rules of Warhammer 40k, you can basically make them do blood sacrifices to you, to amp up the engines of the big knights with some warp power, and cause either D3 or D3+3 casualties on a nearby cultist squad to either get yourself sustained or lethal hits. Basically that means paying something in the region of 15 to 20 points worth of cultists per turn that you want to activate it. And I feel like perhaps the single biggest gain of that is the option to gain lethal hits on the Despoiler Gatling cannon. Those already put out a pretty spectacular rate of fire, 18 shots each, and he can take 2 of them, all at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2, with a range of 36 inches. A profile that's already kind of ridiculously good against a lot of infantry targets out there. Its main issue is if you're wounding on a 5+, then a lot of the damage drops off quite a bit, but lethal hits just helps out kind of fantastically against that. Essentially a plus 50% damage boost against anything it wounds on a 5, or you can look at it as basically getting 6 auto wounds on average each time you fire those guns, and that's quite a lot when those auto wounds come at AP2 damage 2. For the Despoiler, back that up with a Ruinstorm rocket pod, basically 3 crack rockets more or less at strength 8 and damage d6. You get 2 heavy flamers in total built into the Gatling guns, plus a stubber as well for some point defense. Then if you really wanted to absolutely max things out, you could take the Profane Ultra enhancement, that's 20 points, and always causes the maximum amount of casualties on your cultists, so either 3 or 6, and that's allow your weapons to get both sustained and lethal hits at the same time. In any case though, it does make the numbers that this guy spits out rather impressive. This is just looking at the Gatling guns and the rocket pod. You could have stubbers and flamers on top of this as well, but at base for those guns he's already really quite efficient against say termagants or intercessors, and still takes out an average of around about 5 terminators with average rolling if they're not in cover. The main issue he has is if he targets say 3+ save tanks in cover, or big tough targets like a 2+ save Lamb Raider, the damage just drops off really quite a lot. Those Gatling guns don't enjoy wounding on 6s. If you just use the detachment rule though, and either get your choice of either lethal or sustained hits, at worst you're increasing his damage by plus 25%, and that's what it makes sense to do against the termagants, intercessors or terminators. essentially sacrificing maybe like 3 or 4 cultists to slay an extra space marine terminator or something. But it really is the lethal hits that I think are the most impressive thing. They take your average damage up to 18 wounds against, say, a gladiator tank out of cover, or 11 wounds to a land raider. That does feel pretty impressive, given that it's the tank that is really quite good at killing light infantry and has strength 6 guns. It's just kind of unlikely that it'd normally be able to threaten land raider style targets, never mind kill the majority of one. If you add the profane altar buff on top of that, the further increase is actually a little bit less than you might expect. The reason is that you would have already chosen the best of those buffs, so either sustained or lethals to start with, so you only get the second best buff as the extra one. It does maybe feel a little bit more borderline, at least compared with what I would have guessed it would have been, but still if you want to go to absolutely maximal damage output, that'd be dealing like 21 wounds to a gladiator tank. I'd certainly think about splitting fire with him with different targets, or just under 13 wounds to a land raider. There are other ways that you could field him as well. I did take a look at the numbers for the battle cannons too, though in general against those targets they were either the same or worse, and often quite significantly so. Against the previous targets they only really win against the gladiator when it's out of cover. The lower AP really does hurt it quite a bit despite the damage increase. The only major advantage for the battle cannon is wounding on 3+ against things that are toughness 7 to 9, where it'll probably outshoot the gatling cannons. The thermal cannons also feel interesting as well. I guess they'd be using sustained hits basically, given that they already wound most things on a 3. They feel like they only really get impressive when they're within 12 inches though, which might just be a little bit less easy to coordinate, particularly if your opponent knows that you've got the great big Melter 6 guns walking around out there. Otherwise though, if you weren't using the Profane Altar, you could also take the 6+ Feel No Pain one, or the ability to harvest souls at long distance with the Tyrant's Banner. The combo does seem quite good on a Knight Tyrant as well, where they might get a bit more from both having sustained and lethal hits on everything, as some guns prefer sustained hits and some prefer lethals. Overall, at least on paper, I feel like it makes him into a strong enough gun turret that you could definitely consider bringing one, though he definitely isn't so general purpose that you can just bring him and nothing else. His single biggest weakness is things like 2+ saves with cover and maybe Armour of Contempt as well. AP2 means that they'd still be saving on a 2+ if you stacked both of those at the same time, and even if not, then saving on a 3+ is still going to significantly blunt his damage compared with what it would be otherwise. It's still not awful against targets though that have one or the other. He still averages 9 wounds to a toughness 10 target with a 2+ save for example, which I'd say isn't terrible given that that's a slightly suboptimal target. Ideally I think that you'd want to have different Chaos Knights with profiles dedicated to handling those, say some War Dog Brigands with their Demon Breast Spears, and have this guy focus on things like heavy infantry or more normal sized vehicles with 3+ saves. The other biggest downsides I guess are the having to feed cultists into him. It does mean that you're sacrificing around about 15 to 20 points worth of models per turn if you want to charge him up, though I guess you only have to do that when it actually makes sense to, and not against things that he's just going to overkill anyway. It seems to be unlikely to eat his way through an entire 20-man squad over the course of a game, plus you can revive them for 2 command points as well if you want them just to return to the board. I'd say perhaps the biggest downside for him is the lack of Diabolic Bulwark and just the general comparison to a few of the cool things that the core Chaos Knight detachment can do. Not being able to buff his invulnerable save to a 4+ is a bit of a downside when you're building around one big focal model. The detachment definitely has some other advantages though. It's got its rather great advance and fallback and shoot and charge stratagem, which is exactly the sort of support that a great big gun turret knight wants. That'd be helpful with gaining some additional lines of sight and not having to stay in one position if he gets touched by an enemy unit in melee. Though of course he could just stand and shoot with the gatling cannons, that's definitely an option too. Occasionally he might be able to make use of the 4 on Chaos Knight rule, which is a +1 to wound via battle shock. I feel like that's going to be a little bit unlikely though without the detachment rule to trigger a few more tests. And bear in mind that beyond the main things that I talked about with the Gatling guns and the rocket launchers, he does also actually have a fair bit of close range anti-horde shooting as well. 2 heavy flamers and 6 heavy stubber shots could easily clear out a light infantry unit, even while his big guns are focusing on something else. In any case, I did think it was interesting to see a big knight looking quite so scary. Maybe the main question is whether or not this attachment can be justified over the other one in terms of losing things like Diabolic Bulwark and Walk Through Walls. It might well still be that it's just good to focus on a whole bunch of War Dogs and do that, but at least seems like a fairly interesting and kind of fun and fluffy option if you want to put one extra scary big knight on the table. In any case, look forward to hearing your thoughts. Would you be tempted to put this guy on the tabletop? Let me know down in the comments. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that links down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.